The fragile ceasefire holding between Tehran and Washington now feels less like a foundation for peace and more like a stopwatch counting down to the next confrontation. Behind the formal negotiations and public declarations, Iranian officials have begun to make one thing unmistakably clear: diplomacy is conditional and their patience is running out. In briefings on the parliamentary floor and through state channels, Tehran's message is hardened. Talks are possible, but only on terms that Iran says must be met in full. If those terms are not accepted, Iranian leaders warn the battlefield will once again decide the outcome. On Tuesday in Tehran, a spokesman for Iran's defense ministry delivered one of the clearest and bluntest warnings yet. He framed the situation as a test of whether the United States and its partners will acknowledge what Iran calls its reasonable and definitive rights. He insisted Iran has shown a high capacity in both combat and diplomacy, and he credited that capacity not only to the armed forces, but to what he described as the field presence of the Iranian people. Then he issued a stark admonition: if the enemy does not yield to Iran's demands in diplomacy, it should expect a repeat of its past defeats on the military field. He added that any new threat, aggression, or violation would be met with what he called a decisive, final, and regretful response. The spokesman's comments touched on a range of military and diplomatic flashpoints. He pointed to recent incidents at sea near the Strait of Hormuz, describing movements by American warships away from confrontation zones as evidence, he said, of the effectiveness of both the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iran's regular army. His language was unmistakable. The ceasefire may be in place, but in his view, it exists only on paper, and Tehran's restrictions on the Strait of Hormuz remain in force. Sanctions and the U.S. naval blockade, he warned, have not been lifted. Bullets are still being fired. And on the issues that drove the conflict, shipping, sanctions, and the future of Iran's nuclear program, the two sides remain deadlocked. For weeks now, the rhetoric coming out of Tehran has been remarkably consistent across the parliament, the military leadership, and the foreign ministry. No reopening of the strait, no broader concessions, no return to the old status quo until Iran's demands are met. That hardening has now been made explicit as mediators from Pakistan pressed for an agreement. Iran presented what state-affiliated outlets described as 5 hardline preconditions, a list Iran calls the minimum guarantees required before it will even return to the negotiating table. According to reports carried by Iran's Fars news agency and relayed to Pakistani mediators, those 5 conditions are straightforward and sweeping. Iran is asking for an end to the war on all fronts, a lifting of sanctions, the release of frozen Iranian assets, compensation for wartime damage, and formal recognition of its sovereignty rights over the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran argues that without the practical implementation of these confidence-building preconditions, entering new negotiations would be pointless because the basic guarantees Iran seeks would be absent from any future deal. Iran presented these 5 conditions in direct response to a 14-point proposal from the United States. The U.S. document, according to published summaries, laid out a framework in which Iran would agree not to pursue a nuclear weapon and would halt uranium enrichment for a prolonged period, reportedly at least 12 years, and would hand over an estimated 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. In return, the U.S. offered a gradual lifting of sanctions, release of billions in frozen assets, and the withdrawal of the naval blockade of Iranian ports. That exchange of papers has so far failed to narrow the gap. The conflict itself began with a dramatic escalation on February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel carried out strikes against Iranian targets, triggering a rapid series of retaliatory strikes by Tehran against Israeli positions and U.S. allied facilities in the Gulf. Iran moved to close the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that carries a significant share of the world's oil exports. And the region edged quickly toward broader confrontation. A ceasefire brokered by Pakistani mediators took effect on April 8, 2026. That pause in active hostilities was hailed at the time as a crucial opening for diplomacy. But the hope for a lasting settlement has been fragile. Talks in Islamabad and follow-up discussions produced proposals and counterproposals, but they were unable to produce a durable agreement. On May 10th, 2026, Iran formally responded to the U.S. 14-point proposal by sending Pakistan its counter-demands. The response, Pakistani mediators say, made clear that Iran no longer seeks mere dialogue. It wants the terms under which any dialogue double old proceed. The U.S. reaction was swift and blunt. President Donald Trump, before boarding Air Force One for a long-anticipated visit to China, dismissed Iran's response in emphatic terms. In public remarks, he called the U.S. proposal the weakest right now and said of the Iranian paper, "After reading the piece of garbage they sent us, I didn't even finish reading it." He described the ceasefire as being on life support and argued that Iran had been inconsistent, saying one thing and then taking it back. He framed the U.S. position simply, Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. He said they cannot have a nuclear weapon, and they didn't say that in their letter. Those comments came as President Trump traveled to Beijing for talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The trip is being closely watched for several reasons. It offers the U.S. president a moment to seek Chinese cooperation or at least neutrality on the Iran issue. It provides an opportunity to coordinate on trade and energy as well, and it occurs against the backdrop of a ceasefire that, in Washington's assessment, could collapse at a moment's notice. Speaking to reporters, President Trump framed the U.S. posture plainly. Victory, he said, is either diplomatic or military, and if necessary, Washington will not hesitate. We will win it one way or the other, he told journalists. We'll win it one way or the other, he told journalists. Back in Tehran, Iranian leaders are demanding what they portray as basic reversals of the pressure campaign against them. They see the U.S. proposal as one-sided because, in their view, it asks for deep and immediate Iranian concessions, including a long halt to enrichment and the physical transfer of significant quantities of enriched uranium, while promising only incremental relief on sanctions and asset freezes. Tehran's response, as framed by state outlets, argues that trust cannot be built on promises. It must be reinforced by immediate, verifiable actions that change the practical realities on the ground. The dispute over the Strait of Hormuz is emblematic of the broader mistrust. Iran's leaders insist on recognition of sovereign rights over the waterway, which Tehran argues is essential to its security and economic survival. The United States and its partners, however, treat freedom of navigation as a global commons and have warned Iran that sustained restrictions could provoke renewed international intervention. For now, the strait remains a flashpoint. Iranian restrictions persist. U.S. sanctions and naval measures remain in effect, and both sides accuse the other of bad faith. Analysts say the logic of Tehran's approach is twofold. First, Iran wants to secure a set of irreversible gains before it risks bargaining away strategic capabilities. Recognition of sovereignty, a full lifting of sanctions, and the release of frozen assets would fundamentally change Tehran's cost-benefit calculus. Second, Tehran seeks to shift the balance of leverage by making the resumption of talks continue. Gent on trust-building steps that would neutralize what Iranian leaders view as their most pressing vulnerabilities. That posture presents a severe dilemma for mediators. Pakistan, which brokered the ceasefire and has positioned itself as the principal go-between, is now tasked with persuading both sides that the other can be trusted. Pakistani military and civilian officials have shuttled between capitals in recent weeks, working to extend the ceasefire and to find a path toward a negotiated settlement. But mediation is made harder by the very public language now being deployed in Tehran and Washington, language that leaves little room for compromise and that frames the forthcoming period as either concession or confrontation. The humanitarian toll of the conflict is impossible to ignore. Casualty estimates have varied amid the chaos of months of strikes and retaliatory attacks. Public remarks from Washington quoted large round figures for lives lost during the months-long fighting. Those numbers underscore how quickly a limited conflict can escalate into a regional catastrophe. At the same time, economic consequences, disrupted shipping, rising insurance premiums for carriers in the Gulf, and the risk of a sharp jump in oil prices of global reach. The international community watches nervously because instability in the Strait of Hormuz hits consumers and markets far beyond the immediate combatants. In Tehran, the hardline tone extends beyond the military. Parliamentarians and conservative media are aligned in insisting that Iran will not reopen key levers of power like the Strait of Hormuz without ironclad commitments. That alignment matters because it narrows the political space available to Iranian negotiators. Concessions that might once have been on the table are now framed domestically as unacceptable. Tehran's leadership clearly believes that by taking an uncompromising stance now, they stand a better chance of extracting the terms they seek rather than rolling back gains later under pressure. From Washington's perspective, the calculus is different but equally stark. The U.S. insists a long-term freeze on Iran's nuclear capability is non-negotiable and that any lifting of sanctions must be conditional, verifiable, and tied to concrete dismantlement of elements of Iran's nuclear program. President Trump and his advisors argue that the U.S. military posture and the naval blockade have deprived Iran of leverage and that diplomacy must secure non-proliferation results that last for years, not months. In public addresses, the administration has made clear it prefers a deal that locks in constraints on Iran's nuclear program for over a decade. Hence the insistence on a 12-year enrichment halt in the U.S. proposal. Between those two outlooks lies a narrow and rapidly shrinking space for compromise. Mediation by Pakistan and reportedly quieter support from other regional actors has created repeated windows to bridge difference. But the window closes a little more with every stern public statement and every reported escalation at sea. If either side calculates that time is on its side, that it can extract more through delay, then the pause becomes a prelude to renewed fighting rather than a step toward peace. What happens next depends on a handful of choices that still remain open. Tehran can accept at least some of the U.S. proposal and enter an extended verification process in exchange for phased sanction relief and concrete transfers of frozen assets. Or it can demand immediate, tangible rollback of U.S. pressure before it begins to dismantle elements of its program. Washington can accept a deal with longer timelines and intrusive verification in exchange for immediate economic relief for Iran. Or it can harden its stance and risk renewed hostilities if Tehran refuses to provide the guarantees the United States says it needs. Outside players will matter, China, which has cultivated close ties with Talaei-Nik. Pipe, frankly, ever has had to make before. Harden, and is one of Iran's major economic partners, is now hosting the U.S. president for high-stakes talks. Beijing's posture could be decisive. Chinese cooperation might make it politically feasible for Iran to accept a deal, or a lack of pressure from Beijing could embolden Tehran to stick to its maximal demands. Regional actors, including Gulf states and other middle powers, will also seek to shape the outcome, mindful that a return to open conflict would be catastrophic for their economies and security. For ordinary people in the region, the technicalities of enrichment levels and frozen assets are less important than a return to normal life. The freedom to travel safely, to conduct business without the threat of missiles or blockades, and to plan for the future without the shadow of war. For the global economy, the stakes are also real. A renewed shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz would send shockwaves through energy markets and supply chains worldwide. As both capitals posture, the practical arithmetic of diplomacy remains stubborn. If Iran's 5 preconditions are indeed non-negotiable, then whatever future talks occur must be framed as implementation rather than negotiation. A different category of engagement that begins with concrete, verifiable steps on issues Tehran lists as essential. If the United States insists on fundamental long-term constraints on Iran's nuclear program before offering meaningful relief, then mediators face the task of crafting phased reciprocal steps that build confidence in a way both sides can sell to their domestic audiences. The next few days and weeks will be crucial. The ceasefire is holding for now, but many observers say it is fragile. Statements from Tehran hint that the pause could be temporary, a breath before a deeper confrontation unless trust is rebuilt. The U.S. rhetoric equally signals readiness to keep pressure on until its security demands are met. In the middle sits Pakistan, working to translate paper correct. boards into enforceable guarantees, and to prevent a return to open conflict, no one should mistake the current lull for peace. The negotiating table is, for the moment, the most likely venue where the next phase will be decided. But the clock is ticking on both sides, and the kind of concessions each demands may yet determine whether diplomacy has a chance to hold or whether the region will be plunged back into a cycle of strikes and reprisals. The choice is made now. The mix of pressure, concessions, verification, and mediation need to determine whether this ceasefire becomes a fragile bridge to a lasting settlement or simply a brief interlude before the next and potentially more destructive round of fighting.